Before we begin, I want you to take a moment and remember that every voice matters. Eleanor's story is one of unimaginable pain, resilience, and courage. By subscribing to this channel and liking this video, you're not just supporting her story, you're standing with every survivor who deserves to be heard. Join us and help turn silence into strength. I still remember the smell of the old house, damp wood, coffee grounds, and the faint sweetness of my mother's lilac perfume. It's strange how scent can survive time better than memory. I was 8 years old when everything inside me broke, a night that never left, no matter how many decades tried to bury it. Sometimes, when it rains here in Kentucky, I still feel like that little girl again, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles, trembling. That night, the radio in the living room played Patsy Cline. My father, Harold Cooper, had come home early from the courthouse, smelling of bourbon and tobacco. My mother, Ruth, was ironing his white shirts. She always made sure he looked like a godly man, a pillar of our small town of Willow Creek. People used to say, the Coopers are the kind of family every church wishes it had. I used to believe that too, until that night. He called me to the kitchen, his voice soft but heavy. "Ellie," he said, "come here, baby. Daddy needs to teach you something." My hands were still sticky from the caramel I'd been sneaking from the counter. I thought I was in trouble. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile I knew. The air felt thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. When he told me to take off my dress, I froze. My heart thudded against my ribs, and all I could think about was my mother. She was right there, in the next room. "Mama," I whispered, but she didn't answer. He told me not to call her. His voice changed, sharp, low, terrifying. I can still hear it, like an echo trapped in my bones. I don't remember all the words, but I remember the sound, the chair scraping the floor, the soft pop of the radio as he turned it up louder. The first time the world went silent inside my head, I remember my mother's shadow through the crack in the door. She stood there, watching, doing nothing. Afterward, he told me not to cry, said it was for my own good. I nodded. Because when you're 8 and your father tells you something, you believe it. You believe him even when everything inside you says this is wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I listened to the rain on the roof and tried to count the drops, hoping I could outnumber the pain. I thought if I stayed awake, maybe morning wouldn't come, because morning meant pretending everything was fine again. The next day, Mama made pancakes. She smiled at me and said, "Don't forget to thank your daddy for fixing the faucet last night." My throat burned. I remember thinking maybe she didn't know. Maybe she couldn't have known. But then she looked at me, really looked, and I saw it. The knowing, the choosing not to care. I never tasted those pancakes. I just sat there, silent, staring at the syrup melting into the plate, thinking that maybe this was how hell began, not with fire, but with silence. Years later, I would tell myself That was the night my childhood ended. But the truth is, it didn't end. It was stolen, piece by piece. Every night after that felt like a replay of the same horror. The same footsteps down the hallway, the same smell of bourbon, the same silence from my mother's side of the door. I used to pray, not for God to stop him, but for him to make me disappear. And now, 70 years later, I can still hear the echo of that little girl's breath against the kitchen tiles, begging, please, not again. Silence has a way of growing roots. It crawls into your chest, wraps itself around your voice, and convinces you that speaking will only make things worse. After that first night in 1956, silence became the language of our house in Willow Creek. I learned to walk on the edges of sound, careful steps on wooden floors, shallow breaths, soft words that wouldn't wake the beasts sleeping 2 rooms away. My father, Harold, was the town's moral compass, the man who read the Bible aloud every Sunday before church. People called him Judge Cooper, even though he never wore a robe outside court. They said he was a man of discipline. I knew the truth. He was a man who needed control more than he needed love. Mama changed too. Ruth stopped humming while she cooked. She stopped brushing my hair at night. When I tried to talk to her, she'd press a finger to her lips and whisper, "Don't you dare ruin this family, Eleanor May." That sentence became my cane. At school, I sat in the second row, right by the window. Miss Green, my teacher, had kind eyes and smelled like lavender soap. Sometimes she'd look at me longer than the others, like she could see through my practiced smile. She'd ask, "Everything all right at home, Ellie?" I'd nod, always nod, because how could I tell her? How could I say that home was the place where the monsters prayed before dinner? The years between 8 and 13 blurred together, a calendar of pain and Sunday smiles. Every night, I'd hear the clock in the hallway ticking toward midnight, and my stomach would twist. Sometimes I'd count to 100, thinking maybe if I counted fast enough, time would run out before he opened my door. But time never ran out. The kitchen became the center of my nightmares. The smell of coffee and grease, the sound of his boots, the low whistle he always gave before calling my name. Those were my alarms. Mama always found something to do when it happened. Dishes to wash, a floor to scrub. She said it was women's duty to keep the peace. I didn't understand how peace could hurt so much. One night, when I was 10, I begged her to help me. My knees were bleeding from the linoleum floor, and I said, "Mama, please. I don't want him to touch me anymore." She slapped me so hard I fell. Her face was blank. "You think you're better than me," she said. "You think I didn't learn to obey." That was the night I realized she wasn't just blind. She was broken too. Maybe not in the same way, but broken all the same. At school, my grades slipped. I stopped answering questions, stopped playing jump rope at recess. I used to love the sound of laughter. It felt like sunlight. Now it only reminded me That joy was something that belonged to other children. By the time I turned 12, my body was changed, and so was his cruelty. The touches became harsher, the threats colder. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I ended up in an orphanage with the rats and sinners. I believed him, but there was one person who kept me alive, Miss Green. She'd leave an extra sandwich on my desk or slip a small note into my book. You are not invisible. I used to hide those notes under my pillow, reading them over and over on nights when the world felt unbearable. The silence was still there, but it started to crack. Small, almost invisible fractures forming beneath the surface. The kind that eventually split mountains in two. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine what it would feel like to walk out of that house and never come back. I'd imagine the sound of gravel under my feet, the cool air filling my lungs, the taste of freedom. But dreams were dangerous in that house. They made you believe you had a choice. I remember the night I tried to leave more vividly than any other. It was the summer of 1958, and the air in Willow Creek was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and gasoline. The kind of heat that made your skin stick to your clothes and your thoughts feel slow, like honey dripping from a spoon. I was 11 years old, barefoot, and shaking so hard I could hear my teeth chatter, not from cold, but from terror. It had been one of those nights. The kind where silence wasn't a refuge, but a warning. The kind where my father's voice came from the hallway, deep and steady, calling my name like a curse. I'd hidden behind the old wardrobe, pressing my hands over my mouth until my lungs burned. I waited until his footsteps faded. Then I slipped out the window, clutching a small paper bag with 2 biscuits, a cracked photo of my grandmother, and my school notebook. I didn't know where I was going, just away. The moonlight painted the dirt road in silver. Every step hurt. The gravel bit into my feet, but pain was better than what waited behind me. I remember whispering to myself, just reach the highway, Ellie. Just reach the lights. The sound of crickets filled the air, and for a moment, I almost believed I'd make it. I'd walked less than a mile when I saw headlights behind me. My heart stopped. I ducked into the ditch, praying it was some stranger passing through. But it wasn't. The truck slowed, and I heard his voice, calm, almost amused. You think I wouldn't notice, girl? The sound of the truck door slamming still echoes in my nightmares. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quietness of his anger was worse. He grabbed my arm so tight it bruised, threw me into the passenger seat, and drove home in silence. The radio played Patsy Cline's Walkin' After Midnight, and I wanted to scream. When we got home, Mama was standing by the porch light, her face pale and still. She didn't ask where I'd gone. She didn't look at my bruises. She just said, Harold, she needs to learn. I thought learn meant a lecture. It didn't. He locked me in the root cellar for 2 days. No, just the smell of damp earth and potatoes. I remember tracing words into the dirt with my finger, help me, as if someone, somehow, would see. The darkness made time lose meaning. When he finally opened the door, the sunlight hurt my eyes so bad I cried. Mama gave me a glass of water and said, "Don't make him do that again." That was the first time I felt something colder than fear, hopelessness. It was like realizing the world wasn't just cruel, it was indifferent. After that, I stopped trying to run. I stopped speaking much at all. My father called it obedience. My mother called it I called it disappear. The only person who noticed was Miss Green. A week later, she pulled me aside after class and asked, "Did something happen, Ellie? You missed 3 days." I told her I'd been sick. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. Instead, she handed me a small leather-bound book, and of Green Gables. "When you read this," she said softly, "remember that even the loneliest girls can find a way out." That night, under the flickering light of my bedside lamp, I read until my eyes burned. I fell asleep dreaming of red-haired girls who were loved, who were free. And for the first time, I realized that maybe escape wasn't always through doors or windows. Maybe it was through words. I started writing in the margins of that book my own story in tiny pencil letters no one would ever read. My truth was small, fragile, but it was mine. Years later, when people asked how I survived, I told them the truth. I didn't run away. I wrote myself out. But back then, I didn't know that yet. I just knew that I couldn't keep living as a ghost. And so, at 12 years old, I began to plan. Not another escape through roads or fences, but through knowledge, patience, and time. Because monsters grow old, and silence, if you hold it long enough, turns into fire. It was winter of 1959 when my mother made the request. The air in Willow Creek was sharp with frost, the kind that burned your nose when you breathed. I remember the window pane fogged with our breath, the faint smell of wood smoke, and the sound of my father coughing in the next room, a deep, guttural sound that always made my stomach twist. Mama was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her church dress, her lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth. She looked older than I remembered, her hands trembling as she stirred her coffee. The silence stretched between us, heavy, like a rope tightening around my neck. "Ellie," she said finally, without looking up, "your daddy's been through a lot. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. My fingers were picking at a splinter on the edge of the table. I already knew that when Mama began with your daddy, something bad was coming. She took a slow breath. "The sheriff came by today. Some folks have been talking, saying things they shouldn't. About him, about us." Her eyes flicked up, sharp and tired. "You know what I mean." I nodded, even though I didn't want to. My chest felt hollow. "They might come asking questions," she continued, her voice trembling just a little. "If they do, I need you to say that nothing happened, that your daddy never touched you, that you made it up because you were upset." My stomach turned. The room felt smaller. "Mama," I whispered, barely hearing my own voice. She reached across the table and gripped my hand so tight it hurt. "Eleanor May Harper, you listen to me." Her tone hardened. "If you tell those people lies, they'll take him away. They'll take us away. You'll go to some cold place with strangers. You'll never see me again." It wasn't a threat. It was a sentence. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I didn't care if they took him away, that maybe I wanted them to. But when I looked at her, I saw something that silenced me completely. Fear. Not for me, but for him. I realized in that moment that she didn't love him out of devotion. She loved him out of dependency. Without him, she was nothing, or so she believed. The next morning, the sheriff did come. He was tall, polite, with kind eyes that looked too soft for this town. He asked simple questions, but every one of them felt like a knife pressing against the skin of a wound I'd tried to bury. "Has your father ever hurt you, Ellie?" I could feel Mama's gaze on me from across the room, sharp as barbed wire. I wanted to say yes, but when I opened my mouth, the word refused to come. It was like it had died somewhere inside my throat. "No, sir," I said finally. He's good to me." The sheriff looked at me for a long moment, too long. Then he nodded, tipped his hat, and left. When the door shut, Mama exhaled in relief. "You did the right thing," she said softly, almost tenderly. "You saved our family, but I didn't save anything. I just buried myself a little deeper." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something that changed everything. My mother wasn't just silent, she was complicit. Every time she looked away, every time she smoothed her dress and told me to smile, she was choosing him over me. A few days later, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My father's voice was low, angry. "She hesitated," he said, and Mama replied, "She's just scared, Harold." But she did what she had to. The words looped in my mind for days. At school, Miss Green noticed my silence. She always noticed. "You seem tired, Ellie," she said one morning. "Are you sleeping?" I just nodded. How could I tell her that sleep was where the ghosts lived? That week, she asked me to stay after class. "I don't know what's happening at home," she said softly, "but I want you to know something. Telling the truth is never wrong, even if it costs you everything." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But when you're 12 and terrified, truth feels like poison. 2 months later, everything began to unravel. A letter arrived from the county welfare office. Someone had made an anonymous complaint. Mama burned the letter in the sink before my father could see it. But I'd already read the first line. "Concerns have been raised regarding the welfare of the minor, Eleanor Harper." That's when I knew. Someone, maybe Miss Green, had seen me, really seen me. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The first lie I ever believed was that silence keeps you safe. The second was that family means protection. By the time I was 13, both had already poisoned everything inside me. That winter, the church held a fundraiser for needy families, and my father was asked to lead the prayer. I remember standing in the pew, my hands shaking, as everyone around me bowed their heads. When he spoke, his voice was soft, full of the same false humility that had fooled the whole town for years. Lord, he said, bless our children, our wives, and this good community. And everyone said amen. Afterward, people came up to him, to us, smiling, shaking his hand, calling him a man of faith. I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream the truth right there, to tell them what that man did when the doors closed and the curtains drew. But Mama's hand found my shoulder, pressing hard, as if to remind me that my voice wasn't mine. The next week, Miss Green didn't come to school. Rumor said she'd taken leave, but deep down I knew something had happened, maybe connected to that letter. My chest ached in ways I didn't have words for. She was my one glimpse of safety, and she was gone. Around that time, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Money that appeared suddenly. Letters that Mama hid under her mattress. Visits from a man in a dark gray car who never stayed long, but always left an envelope. I'd hear them whisper in the kitchen after midnight, their voices low, urgent. One evening, I crept close enough to hear. She's getting older, Harold, Mama said. She'll start asking questions. She won't, he replied coldly. Not if she knows what's good for her. But if someone finds out, they won't. The sheriff owes me. The preacher does too. You think I don't know how this town works. That's when it hit me. The reason everyone looked the other way. The reason Miss Green's concern vanished overnight. The reason Mama stayed. It wasn't love or fear. It was control. My father owned half this town in favors, debts, and secrets. I went numb. Everything I'd believed about goodness, about justice, shattered. That night, I opened the drawer where Mama kept the envelopes and found one not yet sealed. Inside was money, crisp bills, and a short note. Appreciate your cooperation. Case closed. I didn't understand all of it then, but I knew one thing. My mother had been paid to stay quiet. When I confronted her the next morning, she didn't deny it. She just stared at me with those tired, empty eyes. You don't understand, Ellie, she said softly. This is how things work. You think truth puts food on the table? You think it gives you a roof? Sometimes surviving means knowing when to keep your mouth shut. I stared at her, disgusted. He hurt me, Mama. Her lips trembled, but no tears came. And he feeds us. The world isn't fair, baby. You'll see that someday. That was the day something broke for good between us. I didn't hate her, not yet, but I stopped loving her the way a daughter should. Over the next few months, I became a ghost in that house. I spoke only when spoken to, moved silently, waited for moments when his eyes weren't on me. Every night, I dreamed of running, of trains heading north, of cities where no one knew my name. And then, one night in early spring, the lie began to unravel itself. He came home drunk. I could hear his boots scraping the porch, the clink of his belt buckle. Mama met him at the door, whispering, pleading for him to keep quiet because the neighbors might hear. That's when he said it, words I'll never forget. Let 'em hear, Cleo. They all know what I do. They just pretend they don't. The room spun. I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't afraid of being caught because everyone was already complicit. The next morning, I skipped school and walked to the edge of town where the old railroad tracks cut through the woods. I sat there for hours, trying to understand how a whole world could know something so evil and still look the other way. That's when I made myself a promise. If no one would save me, I'd save myself. It took me weeks to plan, to gather courage, to find a way that wouldn't end with me buried in some forgotten field. But the seed had been planted, and the next chapter of my life began not with escape, but with evidence. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would make the world listen. And I knew exactly where to find it. The night I decided to fight back, the moon was full, swollen, and bright, like it wanted to watch. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint whistle of wind slipping through the cracks in the old window. I sat on the floor of my room, my hands trembling, a notebook open beside me. Every page was filled with detail, dates, sounds, smells, even the color of the shirt he wore on certain night. I wrote everything I could remember, terrified I'd forget something that might matter later. I was 13 and small for my age, but that night I felt older, harder, the kind of old that doesn't come from years. It comes from pain. The plan started simple. Collect proof, then find someone who would have to listen. Not the sheriff, not the church. Someone who couldn't be bought. I didn't know who that was yet, but I believed that if I could make the truth impossible to deny, maybe, just maybe, it would finally matter. The first thing I needed was an object, something that tied him to the things he did, something he couldn't explain away. And there it was, the broom, that stupid, ordinary broom that had been turned into a weapon. I stared at it leaning against the kitchen wall, its wooden handle worn smooth where my hands had bled against it. It made me sick to look at it, but it was evidence. So one afternoon, when Mama went to the store and he was at work, I biked to the hardware shop on Main Street and bought another broom, identical in shape, color, everything. It cost $4.85. I paid with coins I'd been hiding in a tin box under my mattress. My hands shook the whole time I was at the counter, praying the cashier wouldn't ask why I needed it. When I got home, I swapped them, the new for the old, and wrapped the real one in a bedsheet. I hid it behind the crawl space under the porch where only I could reach. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like the world catching me in the act. But somehow, I made it through. 2 days later, I found Miss Green. She was standing outside the general store, her eyes cautious but kind. She looked thinner, worn down, like someone who'd seen too much. I walked up to her slowly, afraid she might turn away. "Miss Green," I whispered. "It's me, Ellie." Her face softened immediately. "Ellie, sweet girl, I've been worried sick about you. I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling. "But you can't tell anyone." She led me to her car, parked behind the store, and I told her everything. The money, the letters, the broom, the threats. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, her hands were shaking. "I believe you," she said finally. "I believe every word." Tears filled my eyes. No one had ever said that to me before. She took a deep breath. "But we have to be careful. Your father has friends in the county office, and if we go straight to the police, he'll find out before we even get there. I know someone, a lawyer in Little Rock, who works with child protections. I'll write to him tonight for the first time in years." I felt something close to hope. It was fragile, like glass, but it was real. That night, when I returned home, everything seemed sharper. The smell of Mama's perfume, the creak of the floorboards, the tick of the kitchen clock. I kept my head down, my heart pounding, replaying Miss Green's words in my mind like a prayer. But the universe has a cruel way of testing courage. 3 nights later, he came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when his boots echoed down the hall. He was drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. "Where's your mother?" he barked. She's at Mrs. Nolan's," I stammered. He squinted at me, suspicious. "You been touching my things." My stomach turned to ice. Did he know? Could he tell the broom was gone? He stepped closer. I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You been snooping, girl?" I shook my head, but my eyes betrayed me. He saw it, the flicker of fear. That night, he didn't hurt me. He just stared, like he was studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. Then, without a word, he turned and left. But I knew he knew. The next day, Miss Green didn't come to school again. I waited for her in the hallway until sunset, but she never appeared. When I got home, Mama's eyes were swollen from crying, or maybe from guilt. She wouldn't tell me why. That night, I dreamt of the broom, of its handle snapping in two, and woke with a scream caught in my throat. Something had changed. Something dark was moving closer. Still, I clung to hope, because once you've decided to fight, you can't go back. The letter to the lawyer had already been sent, and I had the proof. All I needed to do now was survive long enough for help to arrive. If Eleanor's story is touching your heart, take a moment to act. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. By supporting this channel, you help us give voice to stories that need to be heard and hope to those who have endured the unthinkable. The day everything broke open started with silence. Not the soft kind, but the kind that feels like a scream held underwater. suffocating, endless. The air in the house was heavy, the way it always was before something bad happened. Mama moved slowly that morning, her eyes red, her lips trembling when she poured my coffee. She didn't look at me. She just said, "You should stay in your room today, Ellie." My stomach twisted. She knew something. Or maybe she'd finally chosen a side. By noon, I was pacing. The light from the window hit the floorboards in stripes, cutting the room into pieces. My heart was hammering against my ribs when I heard the rumble of his truck in the driveway. Early again. Too early. Then I saw it through the curtain. A police car parked behind him. For a second, I didn't breathe. My mind spun through every possibility. Had Miss Green done it? Was the letter enough? Or had he found it, turned it against me? The front door opened. I heard boots, voices dot my name. Then Mama's scream. I ran to the top of the stairs and froze. 2 officers stood in the living room, their uniforms damp from the rain. One of them was holding a clipboard. My father's face was red and swollen with rage. He pointed at me. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice cracking. "That little brat's been poisoned by that teacher." Mama was sobbing now, gripping the back of a chair. Her eyes darted between him and the officers, panic flooding her face. One of the policemen looked up at me. "Eleanor, can you come down here? Honey, my feet wouldn't move." The world was spinning. I clutched the railing like it was the only solid thing left. Then, behind the officers, I saw her, Miss Green. Her raincoat was soaked through, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. She gave me the smallest nod. That was all I needed. I ran down the stairs. Every step felt like a heartbeat, every breath like a confession. When I reached the bottom, my father lunged toward me, but one of the officers grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs, that sharp, metallic click, was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. He shouted, cursed, called me things that made the officers wince. But I didn't hear the words. Not really. I just stared at the broom leaning in the corner of the kitchen, the new one. The one that meant he couldn't destroy the proof anymore. Miss Green put her arm around me. "It's over, sweetheart. You're safe now." But she was wrong. It wasn't over. Not yet. At the station, everything blurred. The flashing lights, the cold air, the paperwork. A woman from Child Protective Services asked questions I could barely understand. I told them everything, word by word, detail by detail, like reading from my notebook. They wrote it all down. Mama was brought in separately. She wouldn't look at me. When they asked why she hadn't stopped him, she said, "You don't know what it's like to live in fear of a man like him." I wanted to scream. And what about me? But I didn't. I just watched her hands shake as she signed her statement. They took me to the hospital next. Bright lights, white sheets, the smell of disinfectant and rain. A doctor examined me, gentle but silent. He didn't flinch, didn't pity me. That alone made me cry. Miss Green stayed by my bed, holding my hand the whole time. I remember whispering, "You didn't have to do this. He could have hurt you too." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "He already did, sweetheart. Men like that hurt everyone around them, but we stopped them by standing together. It was the first time I understood what courage really meant. It wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, the kind that looks like love." 2 weeks later, I was placed in temporary custody with Miss Green. The house smelled like lavender and books. The first night there, she made me pancakes for dinner. Just because she said pancakes at night felt like freedom. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't have nightmares either. When the trial came months later, I was ready. The courtroom was small, filled with the sharp scent of old wood and cold fear. He tried to look at me, but I didn't lower my eyes. When the judge read the sentence, 15 years, he didn't flinch. But Mama did. She got 8. When it was over, I stepped outside and felt the sun on my face for the first time in what felt like forever. The air smelled like rain on dirt, clean, new, alive. Miss Green took my hand. "What do you want to do now?" I didn't have to think. "Live," I said. "Really live." And I did. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Healing didn't come in a wave. It came in whispers, soft, uncertain, and sometimes silent for weeks. At Miss Green's house, the air felt different. It smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap, like warmth. I woke up every morning expecting to hear his boots on the floorboards, the sound that used to freeze my blood. But instead, I heard birds, a sound so gentle it almost hurt. The first few months, I barely spoke. Miss Green never pushed. She'd leave little notes on my nightstand. "You did well today. Your voice matters." Sometimes I'd find a cup of cocoa waiting when I got home from therapy. The first time I spoke in front of an audience, my hands shook so much I thought I'd drop the paper. But as I spoke about justice, about truth, something inside me stopped trembling. I realized that speaking out wasn't reopening a wound. It was proving it had healed enough to be seen. At 17, I testified in another case, not as a victim, but as a witness. A younger girl, 12, had been abused by her uncle. When I looked at her sitting there, eyes wide with fear, I saw myself. I hated that I missed her. I hated that part of me still wanted her to hold me. Dr. Collins said, "Love doesn't vanish just because it was betrayed. It just gets buried under the hurt." For years, I tried to dig through that hurt. At school, I was the girl from the trial. People whispered when I passed. Some kids were kind, most were curious. Miss Green told me not to let their stares define me. "Let your silence be strength until your voice feels ready," she said. So I listened. I learned. I waited. By 60, the nightmares had become less violent. Some nights, I even dreamed of nothing at all, and nothing felt like heaven. I began writing again. Not in a diary this time, but in letters to the girl I used to be. I told her she was brave. I told her she survived. I told her that every time she thought she was weak, she was just preparing to grow into someone stronger. Miss Green encouraged me to join a debate club. You have fire, Ellie. You just need to aim it. The first time I tried to thank her, my voice cracked like glass. She just smiled and said, "You don't owe me anything, Ellie. You just owe yourself peace." Therapy was a battlefield. The counselor's name was Dr. Collins, a man with gray hair and kind eyes. He never asked questions I wasn't ready for. He'd say, "You can take your time. The truth doesn't expire." I remember sitting there, hands trembling, trying to make sense of why I still missed my mother, even after everything. After the hearing, she hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. "You made me brave," she said. That night, I cried for hours, not from sadness, from release. Years went by. I graduated, top of my class. Miss Green stood beside me, clapping the loudest, her eyes shining like dawn. When they called my name, I looked into the crowd and saw no ghosts. Just her, the woman who believed in me before I even believed in myself. College came next. Criminal law, of course. Every case I studied, every file I read, felt like a step toward reclaiming the world that once crushed me. I wanted to be the voice that kids like me never had. I wanted to be someone's Miss Green. It wasn't easy. The flashbacks never fully disappeared. Sometimes I'd wake up in my dorm room drenched in sweat, convinced I was still in that yellow kitchen. But then I'd feel the cool sheets, the hum of the campus outside, and remember, he can't reach me anymore. By 25, I had become an attorney, standing in court for the first time, wearing my own tailored suit. I felt like I was standing inside a mirror. My voice didn't shake when I said "Your Honor." My hands didn't tremble when I presented evidence. I carried my scars like armor, invisible but powerful. People often asked me why I chose to work with abuse survivors. I never had an easy answer. But one night, while reviewing a case about a foster girl who reminded me of myself, I wrote down what I finally understood, because silence almost killed. Speaking saved me. Miss Green passed away when I was 34. A quiet heart attack in her sleep. I found her on the porch swing, a book still open in her lap. I sat beside her for hours, holding her hand, whispering thank yous she'd never hear. Her will left me the house. When I moved in, it smelled like her, lavender and ink. That home became a shelter. I started taking in girls who had nowhere to go, runaways, survivors, the forgotten ones. We cooked, we laughed, we cried. Every time I told them they were safe, I meant it with every cell of my body. Healing isn't a straight line. It's a circle, one that brings you back to the beginning. Only this time, you're the protector. Returning to Crestwood was like walking through a photograph I hadn't touched in decades. The streets smelled faintly of rain on asphalt. The bakery still had its cinnamon rolls. And the little yellow house, the house that had shaped the worst years of my life, stood at the corner like a scar that refused to fade. My chest tightened as the car slowed. I had rehearsed every word I might say to my mother, every expression I might wear, but nothing could truly prepare me for stepping back into that past. She was waiting in the hospital lobby, frail and shrunk, a shadow of the woman who once held so much power over my world. Her eyes, when they met mine, didn't carry the warm pride of a mother, only fear, regret, and a tremor of guilt. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the fluorescent lights. She looked older than her 72 years, and yet I could still see traces of the woman who once demanded obedience, whose silence had shaped my fear. I didn't rush. I let her stare, let her grasp the weight of what I carried in my silence and survival. She started, but words faltered like broken glass in her throat. I studied her, every line on her face a history lesson, every quiver in her hands a confession. Finally, I spoke, my voice low, steady, and full of the fire that had carried me from victim to survivor. "I know everything, Mom. I know what you did and what you didn't do. I know the choices you made when I needed you most." She started to cry, the tears trembling down her pale cheeks. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I was scared. I didn't know how. Her words tumbled into silence, crushed under the weight of decades. I felt the anger rise, sharp and burning, but I held it back, not because I forgave her, but because I didn't need her permission. We sat there for hours, sometimes speaking, often just breathing in the same room. She explained the fear that had governed her, the shame she carried, the absence of love she had never learned to give. Each revelation was painful, but also oddly liberating. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about condoning her action. It was about releasing myself from the chains of resentment. After that day, I didn't attend her funeral. I didn't need to. My closure wasn't tied to rituals or others' expectations. It was an internal ceremony, a promise to myself that her shadow would never darken my life again. Instead, I focused on the home I had built, the lives I had touched, and the mission I had embraced. I returned to Crestwood repeatedly over the years, not to relive the past, but to make sure the new stories of safety, resilience, and hope were louder than the echoes of my childhood. I hosted workshops, spoke at schools, and mentored young survivors. Every time a girl hugged me, every time a boy thanked me for listening, I felt the years of isolation dissolve. My voice had become more than words. It had become a lifeline. The echoes of the yellow house no longer haunted me. They had been transformed into a quiet strength, a reminder of the person I was and the woman I had become. I had turned pain into purpose, fear into fire, silence into song. And in that transformation, I found the freedom that had once seemed impossible, the freedom to live fully, fiercely, and without apology. Healing, I realized, was never about forgetting. It was about taking the pieces of yourself that the world tried to shatter and building something unbreakable. The first morning I opened the doors to my little bakery on Maple Street. The smell of warm bread and cinnamon enveloping the air. I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Absolute ownership of my life. The walls, painted soft pastel yellow in honor of simpler times, carried a quiet dignity. Each shelf held jars of preserves, rows of pastries, and handwritten notes with words like hope, courage, and resilience. This place wasn't just a bakery, it was a sanctuary, a testament to survival. I named it Grandma's Echo, a nod to the stories my own grandmother had told me as a child, the stories that had taught me that memory, even when painful, could be a guide rather than a prison. Visitors came in hesitant at first, the locals curious about the elderly woman behind the counter with the gentle eyes and the quiet aura of authority. But soon, women started to arrive not just for pastry, but to share their lives, to unburden themselves of secrets long held. Teenagers who had once walked the streets alone now found safe corners in the bakery, scribbling journals or talking in whispers about what no one else had heard. Each confession, each tear shed over a cup of tea or a warm cinnamon bun, reminded me of the little Eleanor I had once been, trembling under the weight of a home that should have protected her but had instead betrayed her. I organized weekly gatherings, a circle of trust, where survivors of abuse could come and speak freely. Sometimes I read from my own journals passages that made my hands shake but made hearts resonate. I spoke of betrayal, of fear, of the long nights when the darkness seemed eternal, but also of the glimmers of light that had carried me through, the unwavering support of a teacher who refused to look away, the legal battle that had restored my safety, and the love I had found in a partner who honored my boundaries and celebrated my resilience. These gatherings weren't just therapy, they were transformation. Women who had once thought their voices were too small began to sing, speak, and act. Every year on my birthday, I hosted a Day of Freedom event, inviting anyone who had survived childhood trauma to come and mark their own victory, however small. There were candles for lost innocence, letters burned to signify letting go, and laughter that seemed impossible in the past but was essential for the future. I taught baking, shared recipes, and reminded each participant that life could be reclaimed, piece by piece. Even the youngest girls learned that power could exist in kindness, and that vulnerability was not weakness, but a form of courage. Through the decades, I became an informal mentor to countless families, speaking at schools, working with local social services, and mentoring young lawyers who wished to fight for justice. My own children, raised with the deliberate care and empathy I had once been denied, carried forward the lessons of accountability, compassion, and courage. They watched me speak publicly about the darkest moments of my life, and they understood that strength wasn't born of perfection, but of survival and commitment to change. When I finally retired, I handed the bakery over to my eldest granddaughter, a spirited girl named Leela, who inherited not only recipes, but also the mission. Watching her knead dough with steady hand, listening to the young women who still came to the bakery for advice or comfort, I realized that my story had multiplied, rippling outward in ways I could never have imagined as a trembling 8-year-old in that yellow house on Crestwood Street, sitting quietly one evening after a long day of laughter, tears, and the hum of ovens. I thought about the life I had built. I thought about fear, shame, and betrayal, and how they had been transformed into courage, advocacy, and love. My past was a shadow, yes, but it no longer defined me. It informed me, guided me, and reminded me daily that even the smallest acts of courage could change a life. I leaned back, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples filling my senses, and whispered to myself, "This is freedom. This is my story. And now it belongs to everyone who dares to survive." The echoes of my grandmother, of my own childhood, of every girl who had been silenced, were no longer whispers in the dark. They were a chorus, loud, proud, and unyielding. And I, Eleanor Whitman, once a frightened little girl, was finally at peace, knowing that the legacy I had fought so hard to create would endure long after I was gone, carrying hope to every corner of the world where shadows still lingered.